Hello, everyone. Today, I want to talk to you all about my Classic WoW Season of Discovery tanking guide, how I see the meta shaping up for the tanks in Season of Discovery, and sort of how I think they're going to perform at late game. This isn't necessarily about level 25 or level 40 or 50 or 60. This is just sort of in a general sense how they're looking. I guess more focused on the end game side of things. But I will also talk about it at times how I think the classes will perform at level 25. Before I get into that, though, I think it's important to understand what a tank does in Classic WoW and sort of your responsibilities as a tank. And it really comes down to basically three core things. You need to A, maintain enough aggro or maintain enough threat that you're keeping aggro on the boss and you're not threat capping your raiders. B, have enough mitigation to survive aggro on that boss and not just survive with 1 HP, but enough that you're not giving your healers a heart attack. And then whatever mechanics for the boss, right? Like don't point the breath at the raid, don't tail swipe the raid, etc. But importantly, all of these are sort of binary things. Did you have enough threat? Did you have enough mitigation? Did you follow the mechanics? Your job as a tank is really not this infinite scaling thing like a DPS where, yeah, I did 2,000 damage, but if I did 2,500 damage, that's even better, right? As long as you have enough threat, having another 1,000 threat per minute or something like that on top of that is going to be basically useless. As long as you're not threat capping your raiders, doesn't matter if you build more threat. And you're sort of more important to focus on other things you might bring like utility or bringing more damage. Obviously, that comes with more threat. And then maybe mitigation is a nice catch all after that. But you just need to have enough of those three to do your job. And then after that, focus on damage, focus on bringing value to the raid in other ways. I think a lot of tanks in Classic WoW, or just a lot of people in Classic WoW in general, don't really understand how tanking works and why there was these things like hit cap and defense cap and blah blah blah, and why the value of like blocks are. So let's get into that a bit. You can see on the left there's this hit table there, and it has all the 8 different ways a hit can go in Classic WoW: a miss, dodge, parry, glancing, etc. Right? Uh, and it's important to note the numbers there are not just arbitrary. That is the priority of each of those types of a hit on the hit table. And what that means is the way this table is calculated is that it adds up all the percentages of each of those things, 1 to 7, and then the rest of it is hits. And it fills in the hit as the rest of it. However, if you have more than 100% chance combined of items 1 through 7 on the hit table, then it will start pushing off types of hits based on the priority, where the top priority is message, then dodge, then parry, glancing, etc. And the first things to go are hits, crushes, and crits. And that's the most important part there. So clearly, you can see if you look at the table, the mitigated types of hits, so block, glancing blows, parries, dodge, miss, etc., are all higher priority than damaging parts of the table, aka crits, crushes, and hits. And so one of the things you can do as a tank is, especially with your abilities, you have ways of generating a lot of block chance or dodge chance or whatever. You can actually get so much block chance or so much dodge and parry chance. You can actually push the rest of those things off the table, right? A classic way of doing this is Warriors. Warriors have a talent, or not a talent, an ability, Shield Block, that gives you 75% chance to block. That is so much block that if you have at least 25% miss, dodge, parry, or miss, dodge, and parry, really, and you get that 75% block chance, you will push crits, crushes, and hits off the table. You cannot be crit and you cannot be crush because it is not on the boss's hit table. And that is the value of block. Block has like this block value. If you look at a shield, it's almost useless. It is a flat reduction on the amount of damage you take. You might get hit for 5,000 and your shield will reduce the damage you take by 50. I mean, it's so small, it practically doesn't matter. So don't worry about the block value. The value of block is just in its ability to push off crits and crushes because it's easy to get a shit ton of block for some classes. And that's sort of how you would do that. That's how those classes become crush immune. Alternatively, you can become crit immune by building enough defense, and we'll get into that on this slide. So this is sort of the applications of that information before. You can see more equations at the bottom is sort of how block value works and how the percent armor reduction or percent damage reduction from armor works. But you might have also heard defense cap for tanks, and like a lot of people don't even know what that does. Defense cap is 140, and it's because a boss has a 5.6% chance to crit you. If you saw from this slide, the previous slide, it was a 0.4% chance reduction to crit for every point of defense you have over your opponent. So bosses have a 5.6% because they're 3 levels higher than you. It's 0.2% per level plus a 5% base. So if you divide 5.6 by 0.04, 140, that's your defense cap, and you become crit immune because it's not on the boss's hit table anymore. They cannot crit you because you just have, there is no crit on their table. Uh, this is like, it's not the most important thing in the world, but it is in terms of like the average damage reduced. But what is important about it is more, and this is more important than average damage reduced, is a spike damage frequency reduction. Is sort of what I called it at the bottom of the slide. Taking more damage as a tank is really not that big of a deal as long as it's like normalized damage, right? If damage smoothness or having fewer peaks and valleys in damage are far more important than just taking less damage overall. You could take like 2 times the damage, but if it came as a very smooth laser beam type of damage, then healers will be able to pump plenty of healing to keep you up. Healers can put out a lot of healing in this game. But if you get hit for a crit and then another crit a second later and Flash Shield takes a 1.5 second cast, you will die before a healer can even react to the fact you took damage and heal you. And so having less spiky damage is one of the most important things you can itemize for as a tank. And you're going to do that usually, like warriors will do that by trying to get enough reduction that they can shield wall or shield block and push those crits crushes off the table. So they just only take 100% after their damage or armor reduction. It's like 50%. They're having a very smooth, steady amount of damage, and they're not having random crit spikes in there, right? Not everyone can do that, but a lot of classes are crit immune now, so they get a little bit of that, but they're not crush immune. So, all right, threat. I'm not going to talk too much on this, but the important things to note: damage is a 1-to-1 ratio. As a tank, you're going to tank by having abilities that have threat modifiers on them to do more damage. You're not going to deal more damage than your DPS. Obviously, you're a tank, but you're going to have abilities like Sunder Armor, or you're going to have flat threat modifiers like like rogues and warlocks do now, or whatever. Shamans have like 100% more threat. And that's how you're going to do more threat than them. Healing and buffs are a global threat generation. It's not to a target. Anyone who is on your mob table, you do a heal. It generates a set amount. So you heal for 200. It's going to generate 100 healing threat. And if there's 10 mobs, every mob gets 10 threat on them from your heal. And that's going to be relevant on the Paladin section. I'll talk about that later. I wanted to bring this up just to shout out Tiger Tesla here. He made a post on Reddit that I thought was awesome. I was going to do this math and sort of show you these comparisons, but he did it for you. A lot of this is going to change even at 25, and I think it's more important to like look at this as a relative sort of how it's looking today and not necessarily read too much into the numbers or the minutia between the different classes. Like Shamans on here are a bit overrepresented. I think Warlocks are a bit under here as well. But anyway, we'll get into it. On this, I think it's important to note, if you look at this, you can kind of look at the blue bars. The green bars obviously shows like with avoidance, but that like the difference between the green and the blue is sort of like how spiky the damage you're going to take is. But the blue bar, you can see like for druids, shamans, and warriors, it's very similar. Those are really looking to be like the most mitigated tanks. It's TBD what the shaman threat's going to look like, so it's hard to say there. But certainly in terms of their mitigation, those are looking like to be some really solid tanks in terms of their ability to mitigate. However, there's some issues with Shaman, and I'll get into that in a bit. All right, let's talk about Warrior. This is obviously, if you've played Classic WoW and you've tanked in Classic WoW, or you've even done any raid in Classic WoW, you're certainly aware of Warrior tanks and their presence in the meta. They are the de facto tank throughout Classic WoW. And it's for a couple reasons. A, they have really good threat. They actually don't do more threat than a bear in Classic WoW, and they certainly probably won't today as well. But one of the biggest benefits of Warriors is you can see at the top of the slide spike reduction. Warriors, when they're not Fury Prodding, they have the ability Shield Block. That gives you, for the next 5 seconds, and it's as long as it's talented, the next 2 attacks will have a 75% increased chance to block. As we talked about in previous slides, that pushes crits and crushes off the table. It's also important, but the important part about that is that 2 blocks might not sound like a lot on a 5-second cooldown, but bosses have a 2-second swing timer. Almost every mob in the game actually has a 2-second swing timer outside of some special examples or special scenarios. So what that effectively means is that you're going to essentially have 80% uptime on your active mitigation. And it's not a random 80%. It is, you have 8 seconds essentially where you're going to be mitigated, and then one attack at the end is going to be unmitigated and could be a crit, but it won't be a back-to-back crit, right? So even if you do get unlucky in that one window where you could be crit if you don't have enough defense, or you can get crushed there even if you're not crit, it's only going to be one. So it's not as bad as if it's just a percent chance on every hit. You're only going to have the one attack. Only one attack can be crit out of 5. So your actual chance to get crit is like 1%, essentially, like that, if you want to think about it that way. They're really good for mitigation, and based on the way things are looking and what other classes got, they're looking to be, if you need a tank that's just going to mitigate the amount of damage a boss is going to do, but still take it, like a rogue, and we'll get into rogues later, warriors are probably going to be your strongest mitigation tank. Their threat's looking really good. Devastate's going to be a strong one, but they didn't really get the big threat modifiers a lot of other classes did. It's TBD how that's going to work out. I suspect they will definitely be stronger on threat. Devastate's going to be a great ability for warriors now for threat gen, but it's unsure if they're going to be just insane on the threat. Druid's probably going to be doing more, especially with MCPs and everything. All right, let's get into Paladin. Paladin's a bit of a weird one. A lot of Paladins, I think, are coping about sort of their viability as a tank. There's some issues with them. I think most importantly, I'm going to bring stuff first. They lack versatility. Every other tank spec, they can actually off spec as some damage. Warriors can go Fury Prot and do Prot also. They don't have to be Deep Prot. Obviously, maybe you want them to be Deep Prot now, but they still have the option to go Fury Prot. So they can come in as an off tank that boss fight where they needed to be tanked at 4 horsemen where you need a bunch of tanks, and then they can go back to DPS for the rest of the raid. Paladins don't really have that option because they have to go deep prot to take advantage of most of their protection abilities. And they can't just say, all right, I'm going to be prot for this fight, and then, I'm just going to swap my runes out and go ret. And maybe there'll be some dual spec thing. We haven't had that announced yet, but for the time being, it's like Paladins don't really have that. And also, as a main tank, they don't really have anything that's going to make them more viable than a warrior so far. They, in terms of single target threat gen, they do, like, they get their mana back on shield block, so like obviously they're going to have to be main tanking the boss so that they can get their mana back whenever they take damage and they get healed and blah blah blah. They don't have to get mana back on shield block; they get mana back on a heal. But they don't have the mitigation of a warrior. It looks like, I mean, their mitigation is random. It's not like a warrior where you plan it out. It's not going to be as spiky. They don't have insane armor gen like a shaman or a druid. And their stuff is just proc based, and it's not that good. Like, Aegis is a better version of Redoubt because you don't have to get crit for it to activate, but it only is 10% chance and works for 5 attacks. So you do the math, it's a half uptime on your active mitigation and random. So it's not that good. Like, it's you're gonna be crit. You're gonna have times where you're not gonna have any active mitigation up, but where do you come in? What's your niche? AoE tanking. Obviously, anyone who's played Paladin knows they're insane AoE threat generators. They're going to be even stronger. They get some threat buffs. They get some new abilities. Obviously with Consecrate, but I think even outside of Consecrate, one of the most insane things Paladins have for AoE threat gen is Blessing of Kings. Anyone who's played Paladin, you've abused this before. Blessing of Kings on a group of warriors or whatever will deal a ton of threat, right? It just does a crazy amount. It does like 800 threat or 900 threat like that instantaneously. And it's global because it's a buff and it's not like a damaging ability. It generates global threat. And so as a Paladin tank, like if there's a shit ton of mobs running around, you can literally drop a Consecrate and just start spamming Blessing of Kings into a group of warriors or something and slurp up every single mob that's in the boss room. You don't even need to be in range of them. Everything will start coming to you. And it can generate just thousands and thousands of threat and really like outpace Fury Warriors on threat. It's an insane amount of threat. So they're going to be really good in those situations and boss fights that are like that. But if it's just the standard tank and spank type of boss fight that Classic has, I don't see them beating out Druids and Warriors so far. Shamans. Shamans are a bit of a wild card in terms of their tanking capabilities. They're going to have a lot of armor, and that's sort of like one of the biggest things about Shamans. They have that shield mastery talent that's going to increase their armor by 30%, stacking 5 times, so 150%. but only on their shield. But the thing that's insane about that is that shields have a ton of armor in Classic WoW. I mean, a shield might have like 2K, 3K armor on it. You get 150% on top of it. It's like you're getting like 7K armor from just your shield. That's already a ton of armor, including whatever items you have on and chance, blah, blah, blah. You might get over 10K armor. That's a ton of just passive mitigation on physical hits you're going to take. However, one of the issues with it is that there's a ramp up time. Paladins don't have shield block. They don't even really have like the sorry, I might have said shaman paladins, but shamans don't have that, and they don't have like the paladin aegis. They don't have these ways of generating block that other classes do, but they need block because they only generate shield mastery procs on a block. So you're going to need to itemize for block to get that up faster, and it means there's a ramp up time. You're going to walk into that fight missing like 4K, 5K armor because you're not ramped up yet. And now they have like that shamanistic rage talent, but that shares a rune slot with some of their tanking abilities. So you don't even want to bring that. So it's sort of this awkward situation where it's like, yeah, they have this when they're up, but when you're running in, and when you're running in is the most vulnerable time you are because the DPS are going to run in, they're going to be idiots, and they're going to parry haste the boss, and you're going to get like double hit and just die. So it's kind of weird. Now, regardless of that issue, sort of like ramp up time with them, one of the other things is that their threat, it looks pretty good. It's going to be bad at 25, by the way. Shaman tanks are probably going to be pretty bad at 25 because they don't have Storm Strike. Lava Lash is useless if you're shield tanking. It's like there's like some useless parts of their kit. They're just going to be shocking and white hitting. It's not going to be an insane amount. They do 100% more threat, but I don't know if that's enough to like match them to a druid. So at 60, their threat gen's TBD. I think they need a couple more runes to really put them over the edge and make sure they're solid on the threat. It doesn't seem to be there yet so far, but it might be good enough. Who knows? In the single target fights, I think at AoE they're a bit better because they're going to flame shock a bunch of guys, and they have the new cleave ability. It's going to be a spell cleave, so that's going to be pretty good. But regardless of all of that, remember at the beginning I said it's just about good enough. So as long as shamans are good enough, they're actually going to be really good tanks because they bring totems. And the fact that they bring totems means that you're not going to have to run a resto shaman in your tank group, right? You can have the shaman tank in there. He can drop the totems. He can buff up the warriors in that party, and they can receive all those benefits. And you don't have to eat up a warrior slot for a resto shaman to buff up both your tanks and the warriors there. So it does bring, and obviously they bring the rest of the totem kits like tremor totems, poison, blah blah blah, whatever, everything else that the shaman brings, and they're going to bring that on top of not having to eat up that extra slot, so it applies to another warrior. They do get natural crit immunity as well, so that's going to be good. I expect them to be very mitigated tanks, but yeah, the ramp up time is pretty annoying, and the threat is TBD. I think they need some more help to really be pumping. But if you're a horde, watch out for shaman tanks. They could end up being your best tank along with druids, just simply because of the raid utility they bring, as long as they're again good enough. Druid. Talking about good tanks. Druid's probably the best tank so far. Everything that's been in, there were already really, really strong tanks. And the fact that they now have Wind Fury on top of being able to bring a survival of the fittest or whatever it is, their tank rune, it's going to be insane. Now, they can't bring those both at the same time, of course. But on the majority of boss fights, most bosses don't hit that hard. Most bosses aren't Big Mac truck hitting the tanks. And you can tank it without that survival of the fittest. So you're going to bring Wind Fury most of the time. And then on those boss fights where it's like, okay, I do need to have more survivability, you can swap it out, and then just for one boss fight, you lose that, but for the rest of the raid, you have Wind Fury. Druids already had just massive health bars and massive armor values. They become crit immune now as well, so that's going to be huge for them. They're going to be really, really, really good main tanks. And if you're coming into SOD, you don't know what to roll, we don't know how the meta is going to shape out, and you want a solid tank to choose, it's going to be Druid. Because even if it turns out that warriors deal more damage, or they have better threat, or they have better mitigation, or whatever have you, druids bring Wind Fury. And because they bring more raid damage, again, so long as they do enough mitigation, enough threat, that they are viable as a tank, the fact that they bring Wind Fury plus leader of the pack for 4 warriors means that they are going to be really basically your best tank for a speedrun setting, which is what the highest level of Classic WoW ends up being anyway, because progression's not hard. Rogue tank. Okay. I've said this in other videos. I'm going to keep saying it. Rogue tank was a mistake. They should not have made rogue tank. Rogue tanks, you look over at the right, they're 1 or 5. That's like, that's what they either suck at it or they're insane. So let me talk about this mitigation. You're going to see that 5 on mitigation. Be like, what the heck is that? Without 100% avoidance, they are bad. They do not have an armor buff. They need an armor buff to be just a generalist good tank because right now they are going to get hit just insanely hard by regular attacks. They don't have a way of mitigating that. The only mitigation they have is just more avoidance, and avoidance is dodge, parry, and miss, by the way. So because of that, it means that they basically need to be at 100% avoidance or they're just not viable. The thing is, they can hit 100% avoidance. And obviously, when you're at 100% avoidance, you are the best mitigation tank in the game because everyone else just reduces damage. You don't even take the damage. If there's a boss mechanic that the taunt swap mechanic is, oh, like we swap on like an armor debuff, it doesn't matter because you don't take the damage. They probably don't even apply the boss mechanic to you, right? So they're going to be really bad. They're going to be bad early on because you need more gear to hit that like 100% passive mitigation. But I mean, obviously on Alliance, there's going to be marbles and stuff for key fights where you can boost that. But they're going to eventually hit that 100% evasion mark, and they are going to be literally immune to boss damage. And they're single target threat. I mean, it's TBD how that's going to turn out, but it's looking pretty good. Rogues are already doing pretty well in general because you can just run in with, Blade Flurry, Adrenaline Rush, Pop Evasion, whatever, and then just start pumping damage, right? Not to mention Thistletea and everything. And really generate just tons and tons of immediate burst threat, which is the time that tanks usually lose threat. But they're just a very binary tank because, again, they don't even bring raid benefit on top of that. It's not like you're bringing like buffs to the raid or anything. Rogues are the most selfish class in the game. All they're bringing is the ability to single target tank a boss and potentially take 0 damage while doing so. So expect rogues to be the worst tank in the game until they're immortal, in which case, if you want an immortal tank, they're your best tank. Again, they don't bring Wind Fury, so maybe you'd still rather have a Druid as long as you don't actually care about the guy being immortal. But if there's like a patchwork type fight and you need to not take damage, then that's the tank to choose. Also, by the way, patchwork's not even a contrived example there. In hardcore, rogues are already tanking patchwork today because people are using marbles plus like 75-80% avoidance you can get in passively as a rogue today. And they're just full tanking patchwork because they take no damage from patchwork. They're literally immune to damage, and it kind of breaks the fight because that entire fight's mechanic is dealing damage to the tanks. All right, Warlock tanks. Warlocks don't look super good so far in a PvE setting. Obviously in PvP they look really good, but in PvE, the 500% armor buff is really good, and it will give them a good 3K, 4K armor or something like that with all their abilities on there, with all their items. It's unclear if their armor buffs, like a demon armor, is going to also get that 500% benefit. Traditionally, those sort of buffs are additive on after the multiplication, and so it's likely no. If it is, that's obviously like an extra like 2,000 armor or something they're going to get there. So that's like pretty important if they do get that buff, but it's TBD. Their threat does look pretty good. They do look they're going to be able to hold threat, but I just don't see them having the mitigation of other classes. Obviously, they are crit immune. They do have that little bit of a damage reduction. They should be viable as a tank. There's no reason that it's looking like they're just not going to be viable, but it looks like they're just not going to be as good at the job as warriors and druids and some other classes. But they're not useless. And this is sort of the thing with a lot of the tanks in SOD so far. They all have their like niche uses on boss fights. Warlocks are a ranged tank. That is very unique, and they're also spell damage based. So if there's a boss that's like physical damage resistant or immune or something, you're gonna need to run a Warlock, right? Like that happened in Classic WoW. You tanked Veclor with a Warlock because I think he's physical damage. Either way, he takes more damage from the Warlock, and he only does Shadow Bolt, so you might as well have a Warlock tank him. But yeah, so it's like if you have a boss fight where the boss is a ranged boss, sort of like the first fight in BFD where it's that water elemental that knocks you off the round, you can cheese that fight by just having the Warlock range tank that boss from the low ground, right? And so there's going to be boss fights where a Warlock is probably going to be able to break that fight and be really good and really strong. I don't think in a general sense they're going to be as good as the other tanks, but I do think they're going to be good. I think you're going to be happy running a Warlock. For those specific scenarios, they're going to be BIS. And I think if you're dead set on playing a Warlock tank, you're going to be able to tank. It's not like you're not going to be able to. I just don't think you're going to be as good as Druid. All right, let's talk about the tier list. Uh, Based off what we've seen so far, it's hard to put Shamans in the S tier. I really wanted to, but I don't think. I think their threat still needs some more runes, still needs some help. It's not looking super sold, but assuming they get their threat issues figured out and they get if the potential threat issues figured out, they generate enough threat and it's totally fine. I can see them being an S tier tank. They have the mitigation to do it. They bring the utility. They're really good. Outside of that, Druids and Warriors, the meta didn't shake up that much. They're still going to be really good. Druids are going to be better than Warriors this time because they're going to be bringing Wind Fury and Leader of the Pack, which is a ton of damage. And they were already tanky enough without crit immunity and the 20% damage reduction to tank literally every boss in the game outside of Nefarian, of course, because Nefarian turns them into cats. But Warriors, very, very strong mitigation tank. If you need a mitigation tank, that's your consistent good option. Shamans are probably going to be a good solid option there too. Paladins and Warlocks don't really have the support of other classes. So far, we're going to need some more runes out of them. I think Warlocks are going to be good. Again, they have their niche uses. Obviously, Paladins still have their uses as AoE tanks. If you need an AoE tank in a fight, no one's going to be better than a Paladin. But outside of that, I don't think that it's going to... They don't seem insane main tanks. Rogues, I didn't even put them on the tier list because before 100% avoidance, they are F tier. With 100% avoidance, I mean, they're immune to damage. So, I mean, it doesn't get better than that in terms of mitigation. If you need mitigation, it doesn't get better than not taking any damage whatsoever, right? So watch out for rogues. Again, they're just a wild card in terms of their ability to tank in this expansion. Expect them to show up and there's going to be a boss fight. It's going to be really hard and say, oh, just have a rogue tank that takes no damage. Easy. Anyway, yeah. Again, thanks everyone for watching the video, and also if you still need a guild for Season of Discovery and you're willing to roll Alliance on a PvP server, check the description below. My guild is still recruiting. We have a lot of signups so far. We're looking like a pretty big active guild, but more never hurts. So thank you.